Well, thank you. Thank you to the ACSA for this incredible honor. Actually, those of you who are sitting in the front, if you want to sort of work artistically and aesthetically, you could actually, with this large and very improbable bouquet, you could probably think of me as taking part of a composition of Dutch still life. Actually, sort of the Millennial Award gives me that kind of sense of age. Well, one of my friends, Lance Brown, actually emailed me very quickly after this was announced, saying, but he thought I was only like in my late 60s. But anyway, it is an incredible honor, and it is true that the ACSA has been with me and the schools in which I've taught for nearly 50 years. So I go back in teaching about half the length of the life of the ACSA, and I'm going to talk a bit about that tonight. And I've had the honor of preparing the NAB report 7 times, 4 times at Cooper, and often served as the ACSA representative on the NAB boards, and often, even more often, as a school, a witness for the school during those visits, trying to persuade the NAB, yes, there is a connection between the high-flown theory, the extraordinarily abstract designs, and practice. By the way, I'm very, very touched that anything I say tonight can be taken down and used in evidence for your CES credits. I think that's something. And the book, I was going to talk a little bit about the history of architectural education, and then I received this extraordinary book in the mail 3 or 4 days ago, and I have to really congratulate Joan Alkman, the ACSA, and all the authors, many of whom are here, for this extraordinary book, which is actually a path-breaking book. There's not another book like it, and it will lead to a vast range of very important research, I think, in not only the history of education, but the thinking through of potential models for future educational structures in architecture. So the real honor, however, goes to those from whom I learned. Colin Rowe, my tutor at Cambridge, who taught me how to read buildings like no other. Peter Eisenman, my TA at Cambridge, who taught me how to draw like Paul Rudolph. And those who he taught me other things too, and he's still on my case, but, and to those who had faith in my ability to teach from graduating from Cambridge in the first place, and that means Bob Geddes, Dean Geddes, who trusted me, hired me as an instructor, appointed me as assistant professor, supported my tenure, and in 27 years at Princeton was my mentor, entrusting me mostly with the chairship of a newly reconstituted PhD program, which we built more or less from scratch, and was, I think, one of the most successful, and still is, one of the most successful PhD programs, interdisciplinary PhD programs in the country. And more than this, I want to thank my students at Princeton, UCLA, and the Cooper Union. That is, all the undergraduates in so many lectures and seminars. I keep on bumping into those who I don't recognize, who apparently tell me they sat in on my large lecture classes at UCLA or Princeton, and tell me that I changed their life, and I don't inquire too seriously as how I changed their life. My graduate design students and my PhD students, from the very first to those who are still with me. Dozens, many of here are here tonight and who've become teachers themselves. To all of you, thank you very much. So an awful lot has happened since I started teaching at Princeton. You can see it on the screen. So that's me in Princeton in 1971, and that's me in my hotel room trying desperately to prepare a talk for tonight. Loss of hair. I saw an extraordinary picture of myself at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies the other day, and I realized that I had to entitle my autobiography, When We Had Hair. And color, of course. I'm still wearing black. And what has not happened is any loss of my passion for architecture and its thought processes, for the history of architecture, in its cultural context, its social and political context, and for working with colleagues of all ages to debate, research, and attempt to impart some of this passion to generations of students. As a trained architect, I never give up on the contemporary and its futures. As a historian, I'm always seeking to reframe contemporary problems in the light of their often forgotten, or more often or not distorted history. As a thinker, I'm always searching to insert architecture into the larger world of ideas and to activate its disciplinary aspects to think about itself. 100 years of the ACSA then, from 1912 to 2012, when it would have been hard to find a woman in any group shot of 1912, to now, when women, while still not represented as strongly as they should be, represent some 30 to 40% of students in many schools, if not of practicing architects. Certainly minorities have made some gains, but far too small ones, and we have much work to do to make out a discipline as diverse as the world it serves. 100 years ago, when the technologies of design and construction were just emerging from the first industrial revolution, to today, when, as we've seen at this conference, they now have, thanks to the digital revolution, following the revolution of the first and second machine ages, emerged as the most sophisticated tools imaginable for representation, design, and fabrication. So tonight, in recognition of the honor bestowed on me for services to teaching and scholarship, I want to resume some of the interests that have sustained me over the last 50 years, half the life of the ACSA, and to offer some observations on the state of contemporary thinking. Not only about the digital and its aptitudes, for which I'm not entirely trained, but about architecture in general in the present world. With respect to the digital, though, I will say one thing, and I'll speak about it a little later. I propose the following, based on a very cursory survey of the literature that we've been presented with over the last 2 decades. I think there are a great number of digital theories of architecture, going from broad opinions as to the general cultural effects of digital media to detailed research papers on code writing and software use. But I think we've seen very few yet of what I would call architectural theories of the digital. That is the development of serious thought from inside the discipline itself about the changing nature and role of an architecture emerging from the use of digital processes. At the same time, we're presented with a host of images and forms that I would call digital effects, from blobs to parametric iterations, all of which I would submit need a better theoretical foundation than a simple ascription offered by many, including Patrick Schumacher recently, of a new style. But I'm going to talk about this a little later. So here we go. As you know, I was educated as an architect at Cambridge under Leslie Martin and Colin St. John Wilson. My tutor on the right is Colin Rowe, who taught me every week, an hour a week for 2.5 years, how to read architectural theory, read plans and sections, analyze precedent, and abstractly support design, and finally to write. My TA was a young PhD student just arrived at Cambridge called Peter Eisman, on the left, who taught me how to design, and more importantly, for employment purposes, to draw like Paul Rudolph with a ruling pen and hundreds of lines per inch, hatching, as Mark mentioned last night. I then joined the faculty. Oh, that's my graduation picture. You drew on double elephant boards in those days with T-squares, and I still have the T-square, but I don't have the board. It didn't travel across the Atlantic very well. I then joined the faculty at Princeton under its new dean, Bob Geddes, who you see here on the left looking slightly worried. He's looking worried because he knows that I am in about an hour to read the school's strike motion following the shootings at Kent State. And you can see me standing in front slightly nervously of the assembled populace of Princeton University reading out the intention of the architecture school plus all the other schools to go on strike. I then embarked on the most extraordinary series of experiences I could have ever imagined. Asked to prepare a graduate seminar on the analysis and theory of architecture from 1700 to 1900, Ken Frampton had tied up the modern period, I began a research program that has not stopped to this day. starting with the Enlightenment and moving on to monographical studies on Ledoux and the utopians of the 19th century, thence to the history of modern urbanism. I was immediately taken up by the discourse on institutions introduced by Michel Foucault in the mid-1960s and by Robin Evans' studies on Bentham, and the study of the development of political and social power through the built environment and its monuments. Illustration from Michel Foucault on the right, and a relatively unknown plan by Jeremy Bentham for an economic school. I thought of it as we were thinking about reinventing Cooper the other day. It's very economical because there's one teacher in the middle on a rotating pedestal, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 classes are being taught at one and the same time. That's me teaching Jeremy Bentham in the 70s, which led to my interest in typology, one that I shared with someone who became a great friend, Aldo Rossi, and one that has reemerged lately with the development of technologies that Mario Carpo has called non-standard, a prophet of the digital. Along the way, and from early on, I was deeply influenced by the ever-dwindling group around Guy Debord in France. I was actually once asked at a political rally in Cambridge to join the Situationists by someone who was a Situationist but got expelled the next year, so I was very happy that I didn't, in fact, join. But I was tremendously interested in Debord's work on the psychology of spatial forms, an interest that was shared at the time in the early 70s by two very close friends and colleagues, Rem Koolhaas and, of course, Bernard Tschumi, with whom I taught at the AA under Alvin Boyarsky in the early and late 70s. Underlying this interest in psychology and drawing me into a study of its history in the modern period was my fascination with Jacques Lacan's rereading of Freud. This led to 2 books, one on the notion of the uncanny and the notion of the, which in German has a very appropriate title, the unheimlich, or unhomely, and one on the more public notions of phobia, agoraphobia and claustrophobia, and looking to reread the very popular book that was popular after it had been translated after some time of Gilles Deleuze on the fold. It was the interest of Greg Lynn and Peter Eisenman in exploring the new geometries, or rather topologies, that Lacan himself had used to characterize the complex inside and outside surfaces of the psyche that brought me to my own rereading of Gilles Deleuze, whose work on Foucault I had read long before, and that difficult book on le pli, or the fold, a word that I found was being all too literally taken up by architects. You just have to fold the building, and you've done a Deleuzian job. This rereading led to a relationship that I felt was very interesting between the way in which Deleuze had both reconstructed and rethought the implications of the Leibnizian geometries or topologies, and that linked to the notion of the Baroque itself, as he read the newly translated into French book by Wölfflin, Renaissance and Baroque, from whose text he gained the illustration that then became, of course, the diagram of his notion of the Leibnizian house, the Baroque house. Leibniz, of course, having said that the soul has a number of windows, windows to the world, and those produce sensations which are then, in a sense, processed by this waving veil that he saw in the camera obscura of the mind. This then became a way for me to look at the animate form productions of Greg Lynn and his particular experiences in the first wave of his production of the digital. In 2003, however, I was approached by the Berlage Institute and the Technical University of Delft, asking me to submit a mid-career dissertation for their new PhD program. In 2005, accordingly, Pierre O'Reilly and myself stood for the first public orals in that program. It was extraordinary. The Delft Institute of Technology, you still have to wear white tie and tails and do a public defense of your thesis, the most terrifying thing that I've done in my entire life, bar this lecture. This program was dedicated to mid-career scholars and practitioners looking back and reflecting on their own development. So I took for my study the 4 historians who had the most profound effect on my own thinking. One I never knew, Emil Kaufman, whose book on the Enlightenment had first stimulated my interest, and then Colin Rowe, Rainer Banham, and Manfredo Tufuri, almost in the chronological order that they had attracted my interest and influenced. In searching, I found this photograph in the RIBA Journal of 1961. There's Rainer Banham on the left in a rather uncharacteristic black tie, no doubt respectful of his own PhD advisor, Nicholas Pevsner, in the middle, and on the right, John Summerson. They were conversing following Pevsner's groundbreaking announcement of his worries over the return of what he called historicism, by which he meant what later critics like Charles Jenks called postmodernism, a lecture in which Pevsner himself used the word postmodern architecture for the first time. Banham, of course, would have nothing of it, having launched his crusade for another architecture founded on technological progress. And Summerson had just published his article, interestingly enough, calling for a new source of unity for architecture based on what he called a program, by which he meant a program based on the emerging new sciences of biological analysis, the analysis of DNA, the analysis of the structure of molecules, as potentially offering the conjunction between rigorous programming and bioforms. Bioforms, of course, had been in the air in the 50s in England and certainly were part of my education. Many of the independent group would come up to Cambridge, the Smithsons, of course, and Eduardo Palozzi and others would come up to Cambridge and talk about bioform, but we remember that Lawrence Law White produced the Aspect of Form compendium for this Growth and Form exhibition with Nigel Henderson and Banham and Richard Hamilton of the early 1950s, and of course the exhibition Life and Art, the intersection of life and art, which was also put up in London by the same team, and that, of course, prefacing the extraordinary group exhibition of, I'm just going to go to here, of This Is Tomorrow of 1956. The poster by a young artist called John McHale and Richard Henderson, the artist. Now back to this. This strange exhibit, which you see in front of you, was the exhibit concocted by James Stirling for This Is Tomorrow exhibit. It turned out to be a model, a three-dimensional model in plaster and wire of the deformations formed by soap bubbles when stirred up in water in a washing machine. But you can see that in some way or another, we are beginning to look at molecular, biological, and topological form in a way that wasn't directly followed by Stirling, but in a way that was followed by many architects and is still followed now in terms of the topologies of the digital. So this strange exhibit concocted by Stirling, unnoticed at the time, but I think of great interest today, led me to another connection based on another group photograph. Here we have young Jim Stirling on the right. Those of you who knew him later will remember his sizable presence in the room. In these days, he was called Slim Jim. And on the left is John McHale. And in between is the artist, Magda Cordell, who later became Magda McHale. This became a very interesting photograph for me because you suddenly saw that John McHale was moving through the independent group, was moving into an arena that begins to come to our present and bring me to the present and my interest in following through some of the historical and theoretical questions opened by the digital turn. And of course, Mikhail was the one who chose in the ceiling of this rather banal row house in London to montage a cutting from Life magazine, the first digital portrait stitched together of the Earth from a satellite. The opening up of the Earth, and of course, Mikhail's own opening up, working with Buckminster Fuller, an extraordinary work published in 1971, The Ecological Context, in parallel with The Future of the Future. This is a work that, if you read it carefully, could have been written today or yesterday or tomorrow. It has all the signatures of a critical analysis of world resources, a critical analysis of their diminution, and a critical analysis of global warming. And of course, that's where our friend Rainer Banham was able to begin to look urbanistically at the notion of ecology, or rather look ecologically at the urbanistic structure of Los Angeles, something he had been seeking in his seminal articles, Architecture After 1960, and of course, his 1971 Los Angeles, The Architecture of Four Ecologies. And speaking of the ACSA cruise ship, an extraordinary metaphor that I think now intersects very much with my own talk, I've been struck by Greg Lynn's turn towards the digital processes of fabrication and his parallel interest in sailboats and the new high-intensity baking of sails in big bags, as opposed to the bolting of things and the mitering of things together in the old technologies. So these new technologies of sailing are, in fact, influencing in a very powerful way the new technologies of the digital. But let me, as a historian, go back a little bit, so to speak, back to the future, because this historian has ever led me to think of another modern theorist who was equally enamored of boats, and his name was Carlo Lodoli in Venice in the early 18th century. He was called the Socrates of architecture. He came from a family involved in shipbuilding at the Arsenale and established a private school for the sons of nobility in architecture. His portrait is by Alessandro Longhi, you see it here. His student memo recalls that he was dressed in a friar's habit, which contributed to make his appearance too unconventional to appear gallant. If you consider the blood clotted in his face, the unkempt hair, the piebald, stubby chin, those sparkling, fiery eyes, it could almost frighten the more delicate souls. Certainly they did not fit the bawdy words with which he sometimes peppered his talk agreeable, a picture of the perfect professor. He said, in his Socratic way, building must be united with reason and let function be the representation. He was the one who, in fact, explored the structural virtues of the catenary curve in stone, of course, and in metal. A catenary curve, which I gather from many, is still quite difficult to draw today. But his prime example for the best role model for architecture was the gondola. The gondola, he says, could not have been more smooth-moving, could not be more obedient, could not be stronger. There it is in Canaletto, and there it is in structure. Could not be more obedient, could not be stronger, could not be more elegant in any of its parts, precisely because its single piece of wood had its form proportioned in relationship to its special character, put in place with reason, what he called naked reason, which just followed simple requirements, obliging everyone to feel no discomfort whatever. And wouldn't it be possible, he concluded, to make houses like those rational Venetian gondolas? And from the gondola, he designed a chair that was organic and referred to a form that would adhere to the human body, with a shape that curved to the back, with the bottom of the seat hollowed out. He had a chair made. It had it shipped to Paris by the Venetian ambassador. It was exhibited in Paris, and it became the basis of the entire formulation of the idea of type in architecture at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century by that slightly pedantic theorist Quatremé de Quincy, who was a friend of Jacques-Louis David, and who, here we have the ship of the Argonauts in one of Winckelmann's engravings, exactly taking the form of the chair and the form of the gondola prow, and Jacques-Louis David actually having Jacob, his cabinet maker, building a chair just in the functional lines of the gondola prow, the back, and the seat. I remember taking my 5-year-old to the Louvre once and taking him around and asking pertinent questions of these paintings with which he was not particularly preoccupied. But then standing in front of this painting, I said, what do you think this painting is about? I thought he was going to say, well, it's about the death of the execution of the sons of Brutus for making a royalist reaction in Republican Rome, and they're being carried back to the house, and Brutus is sitting pensive, and the family's going crazy in the background. No, he said, oh, Daddy, it's about a chair. And I said, how do you know it's about a chair? He said, because it's in the middle. And so here we have, and of course, David is saying something. He is saying that this is the modern chair. This is the chair that no one yet in Paris in 1787, 2 years before the revolution, had a right to sit. So it was a chair awaiting its revolutionary Republican sitter. Some of the drawings for the chair. And of course, Le Corbusier, when he goes to Venice, is not particularly interested in Venetian architecture, but what he is interested in is the gondola. 1934, he was asked to give a big disquisition in Venice on the architecture of Venice, and he was struck, he said, not by the romanticism of Venice, but by the gondola, the discovery of this magnificent tool. For him, in a talk supposedly on the subject of art and reality, in a conference dedicated to a discussion of contemporary arts and reality, Le Corbusier waxed eloquent over the gondola. He adopted the gondola, in fact, as the best of all object types, typical objects. The gondola, concluded Le Corbusier, is a standard object, much more standard than a car, comparable to that of the Greek temple. And you remember his famous double plate in Vers une Architecture, where he has the temple of Paestum, the temple of the Acropolis, the Phidias temple, and underneath the old Humber car, and underneath the Acropolis temple, he has the Parthenon, he has the Grand Sport de l'Age, which he later saved up to buy, and photographed in front of all his villas in the 30s. It was therefore the gondola coming from Laudelie, who Le Corbusier had read, and of course he built his own gondola, or proposed to build his own gondola in the Venetian lagoon. And here, in more contemporary terms, is Miranda Leonard's extraordinary house built like a sail, out of pieces prefabricated, digitally scanned and prefabricated, and structurally welded in their ability to hold together like a shell. And then comes this, a big book, 464 pages long, and threatened another second volume, 560 pages long, which attempts to propose an overarching and totalizing theory of the parametric. Patrick Schumacher, the partner of Zaha Hadid, has now waxed eloquent in what he calls a treatise and a manifesto for the parametric, which will provide, in an autopoetic way, a word that he takes from the German sociologist Nikos Luhmann, the sense of an all-embracing, all self-motivating, self-iterating, self-adjusting, self-adapting, totalizing work that will allow for contextual work at all scales and in every way. I haven't read it yet, so Antoine Piquant reviewed it very nicely in Log, and I think what he said is fine, and if you want to, I agree with what he said. Okay. So this leads me to my next field of study, which will obviously appear in several articles over the next few weeks, years. And what interests me is that which occurs just before that which occurs. So I'm always interested in historically that which, in a sense, precipitates a climate of opinion, a way of visualizing problems, a way of conceptualizing that then enters into and erupts into the different forms of design practices. So here I'm interested in two individuals. I'm interested in Nicolas Chauffer, whose cyber city experiments with total environments in light and movement and motion. In the late 50s and early 60s, this is his studio, begins to investigate in a very creative way the topology of the audible, sound, the topology of rhythm, time, the topology of light, and also begins to construct these light towers which are fueled, if you like, by very primitive computerization, but which are in fact models of a cybernetic universe that he felt could be, in a sense, modeled to adapt itself and for us to adapt to our own cybernetic worlds, and of course the topology of space, and ecologically, the topology of climates. This Ville cybernétique is one of the most powerful little treatises of the early 60s, and one which I would commend to many who are trying to reinvent a wheel that has already been invented a few years ago. And the second would be Yanis Xenakis, not so much for the work he did, although it was quite pioneering for Le Corbusier and the Phillips Pavilion, but the work he did afterwards. And here I just show you very quickly the sketches and project that he did for the Cité de la Musique in Paris during the competition, which he did not win and it was not built, but an extraordinary exploration into the relationship between music as a practice, music as a performance, music as a teaching activity. This was a cité that was to be part of the Academy of Music and the teaching structure of the Parisian musical culture, and a museum of musical instruments. Well, it wasn't in the end Xenakis who won the competition, but I still find, going back into the geometries of his project and the final project, an extraordinary inventiveness that we would do well to re-look at. As he said, to realize something different from a traditional building, that is to say, to discover fundamental questions, the lines of force. That supposes the abandonment of architectural prejudices. Too often, one multiplies identical elements, one repeats a rhythm, a module, pilotis, beams, and orders. On the contrary, my voile, my net, my sail is a continuous aspect of construction in space. There are prejudices also concerning the uses of building, its function, but there are many ways other to think about function. One must invest architectural space and not select it. One must invent architectural space and not select it as if it were already distant. It is a place to discover according to the fundamental necessities which weigh on us. There are things which one cannot imagine, and one must search to create them. One must therefore work in the domain of theory, without which you're enslaved, trapped by cliches, by inherited structures you utilize it without perfectly understanding them. Theoretical exploration avoids making such mistakes. The theoretical effort departs from intuitive premises, aesthetics, ideas, explores, and serves as tools. Logic, other knowledge coming from the other sciences, these are the tools, and this is thus one must use them. For example, he concludes, if a computer composes a piece of music that you judge to be bad, you must not respect it simply because it's the product of a computer, like certain contemporary musicians. On the contrary, one frees oneself from this theory so that the result becomes interesting. Theory and the machine are not criteria, Music, and I would substitute architecture, is the final criteria. Thank you.